First of all, welcome everybody to day two, the session on embedding social cohesion tools in program monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems. My name is David Alfer. I will be moderating the session today and helping with the questions afterwards, but the stars of the show, you have their bios, their names in front of you, so I will let them introduce themselves as we get to each session, and I will get things kicked off in the meantime. So very briefly, to set a stage you're already familiar with, the world is not looking in very good shape right now. Rising conflicts, climate shocks, food insecurity, and authoritarianism, to name a few dynamics, falling development indicators, social cohesion and political trust, to name a few others. These are all critical problems in their own right, but in concert, they begin to combine and add up to more than the sum of the already worrisome parts. So how do we hold all of this together? All of the good stuff is one of the greatest questions of our times, in other words. Another is, how do we measure peace as well as conflict in order to make sure we can design and target programs to do something about not just holding it together, but healing it as well? Now, measuring peace is far from impossible, but it is complex, and it's absolutely critical to master that complexity, and we'll all speak to this today. So historically speaking, there have been several basic difficulties with that measurement. There are two that I'll highlight as particularly relevant here, however. First, we in the peace-building community are in a constant fight against this mistaken idea that measuring peace is counterfactual, the absence of something rather than the presence of something, and therefore impossible to measure. Now, that is not actually true, but it's a remarkably durable myth, and it persists to this day. Second is the complexity of measuring perceptions. Now, perceptions are critical because peace is usually less about the nuts and bolts of a situation and much more about how people feel about those nuts and bolts. The measurement of something that can't be counted tends to make a lot of people's blood pressure go up, but it's entirely doable and it does garner valid results. It's just not as linear or simple as something like how many trainings did we hold and how many students were in each one. So there are in turn two keys to these barriers. The first key addresses the counterfactual. By examining a dynamic like social cohesion, we're looking under peace's hood, as it were, and asking what dynamics have to be present in order for peace also to be present. What markers can we lock in on that by their own presence and strength also give us a sense of the presence and strength of peace overall? The social cohesion is one of those markers. On its own, it might not be sufficient to define a state of peace, but it is a necessary component of peace, and it's something we can measure the presence of using perceptions as indicators. The second key is dealing with complexity. Yes, perceptions are complex and nonlinear, but that's the nature of human society and the nature of peace and conflict. Trying to deal with that using linear quantitative measurement methods is akin to the old saw about using a square peg in a round hole. What's required is complexity awareness and nonlinear systems thinking that allow us to better see and understand the complexity and work flexibly and adaptively to match the conditions as they are on the ground. So to that end, what we have here for you today is work done by two organizations in particular, Institute for Economics and Peace and Catholic Relief Services, to measure social cohesion and perceptions. Perfect. We're also going to get you some audience participation and involve you as the listeners as more than an audience. We also hope, of course, to generate some robust questions after the presentation. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I will turn it over to Michael.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and welcome everyone. And David, kind of sort of a number of things that you said kind of sort of really kind of sort of stuck with me. Probably the first one is that element about measuring peace, right? And probably most importantly in terms of trends, right? I mean, if, within the peace building field, we're trying to determine how well we are doing programmatically or where we need to prioritize, for example, understanding these trends is really important. We were having a number of conversations the other day, and one of the examples of this is that, in any individual country or community, you could have a couple of different indicators, one that is, relatively low or bad, right? Depending on, of course, the metrics that you choose. One is relatively high, but let's say that the one that is low is actually improving quite quickly prior to programming, whereas the one that is high is actually deteriorating. There is a choice there, for example, on what kind of intervention you would try to make. So a very important consideration there. And then with regards to the myth of peace building, and yes, sorry, the myth of measuring peace, also something that's quite common. You know, ourselves, the Institute for Economics and Peace, we're essentially really dedicated to that, to measuring peace and the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peace. One of the analogies that I don't use too often because it's not great, but it does actually help sort of visualize this to a degree, is if you can measure, for example, the days that it rains in any individual year, then by extension of that, you can also measure the days that it doesn't rain, for example. So that, you know, conceptually at least provides us with the ability to start measuring peace in very interesting ways. You also talked about the perceptions component. I mean, that's core to any individual in any community's decision-making process. So it's very, very important to understand what perceptions are, but also we need to kind of sort of acknowledge that perceptions on many occasions can also be wrong, for example, right? So we also do a lot of work which looks at different, you know, how different structures are improving with regards to poverty and education and people's perceptions of those structures. And on many occasions they are similar, on many occasions they're different as well. So something very important to consider. For example, we produced this report called the Safety Perceptions Index. And in 2021, prior to the war between Russia and Ukraine, the vast majority of Ukrainians and Russians perceived being at war as very low risk compared to other priorities that they had in their life. And look, obviously, where we are today. In terms of the social cohesion element, ultimately, I think a lot of it also depends on kind of how you define it, right? So if you think of probably the simplest definition of social cohesion that I've seen is this one. It's the bond or glue that maintains society together, right? Which is great. It's all encompassing, a very nice definition. But if you look at social cohesion from a personal perspective, until you know, in terms of how people get on with each other, then it also becomes an interesting way to explore. And lastly, the question of complexity, which I'm going to jump in now, and simplifying complexity, probably the most important thing. Jimmy, could I get you to move the slide forward, please? Very quickly, in terms of the Institute, again, a nonprofit dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. We essentially try and answer these two questions that you see in front of you here. We produced this report called the Global Peace Index, which essentially tries to determine what are the world's most peaceful countries. Again, a complex topic. It's challenging to do, but conceptually it's quite easy, right? If there is a country that has low levels of crime, if there's a country that has low levels of conflict, for example, low levels of incarceration, then those are symptomatic of higher levels of peace. It's quite measurable, in effect. The more important question, though, is what do they have in common, right? Because if we develop a deeper understanding of that, the more likely it is that we are able to sort of replicate those conditions in our own societies. Jim, is the next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of sort of how these two questions are answered and how we talk about them, this coincides with two concepts that I'm sure a lot of you are a lot more familiar with than I am. These two concepts of negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace, we would talk about as being the absence of violence or fear of violence. Now, again, it is, as David alluded, it is the absence of something, but it is something you can measure, right? Because you can measure violence. So the absence, you know, when there is no violence, there is an absence of violence and therefore a negative peace. Now, that's a good starting definition of peacefulness, right? Where there's, again, low levels of crime, fewer violent demonstrations. It's a symptom of high levels of peace. But the really interesting stuff, but also the complex stuff, is trying to understand more about the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peace, positive peace. Jimmy, next slide, please. Thank you. On the left-hand side, the negative peace side, again, looking at all of these different metrics, including some of the ones that you see here on the right-hand side, military expenditures, political terror scale, refugees, homicide levels, availability of arms, weapons exports. You can look at all of these things and you can develop relatively neat calculations. The Global Peace Index ranks countries according to their level of peacefulness, but you can throw all of that together and you can say, for example, that last year we deteriorated 0.3% in peacefulness around the world. Again, this seems somewhat esoteric, but it's critical to understand where we are in terms of trends, to understand where we want to be and what we can do. And we can break that down into individual indicators, to a national level and to a subnational level also. Jimmy, next slide, please. Now, going back to the positive peace side of the equation and how we would measure that. Well, if we've started with a tight definition of peacefulness, we can then look at what are some of the most peaceful countries and do statistical analysis to be able to better understand what are the socioeconomic and attitudinal factors or social cohesion factors on one side, for example, that are statistically correlated with improvements in peacefulness. What moves on one end over here that then correlates with an improvement on the other end over there. Now, this is relatively complex statistical work, and we found over 500 indicators that actually show these correlations here. When we continue to work on these, we see that for the most part, they fall off there entirely, fall within 8 different categories. Jimmy, if you could please move to the next slide. Thank you, which we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. So we see through the analysis that countries, peaceful countries or countries improving in peace, are ones that are making changes or improvements in all of these pillars. One of the really interesting things about this is that we see the countries that become more peaceful make small changes to all of these pillars simultaneously, rather than making a massive change in one single pillar. So if one thinks of social cohesion as the bonds or glue that maintain society together, you can really see social cohesion being defined as what we would see here, or alternatively, social cohesion throwing through all of these different pillars. As a total aside, countries that are improving or have high levels of positive peace benefit from a whole other variety of components, such as the ones that you see here on the right-hand side. Jimmy, next slide, please. So specifically in terms of social cohesion and perceptions, Jimmy, let's jump to the next. And thinking very briefly about the pillars of positive peace, again, we can see, for example, if we follow the more personal definition of social cohesion, that good relations with neighbors as a core pillar of positive peace is a very good example of the role that social cohesion plays. Now, you can also see how when levels of social cohesion are lower, for example, it can have an impact on each of these individual pillars as well. And this gets very much to what David also talked about, right, is the complexity and the systemic nature of peace, conflict, and peace building as well. Also, as and when a government weakens, or as and when there is a decrease in the free flow of information, that impacts social cohesion as well. So what does kind of sort of all of this look like from a practical perspective? Jimmy, next slide, please. I can't even remember why I threw this slide in here, so we're probably going to skip over it, but it is quite interesting. So let me just stop on it very briefly. This is a measure. We do an annual measure of levels of positive peace around the world at the country level and subnationally too. One of the things that we've seen over the last few years globally is, whereas although there's been an overall slight improvement in positive peace, things like structures, right? Structures is basically levels of poverty, educational attainment, life expectancy, for example, have improved significantly around the world. Institutions, for the most part, have also strengthened. However, attitudes, the way that we treat essentially, has actually deteriorated over time. Things included in what we call the attitudes domain, for example, again, the quality of information that people receive, perceived levels of injustice around the world, etc. So a very interesting phenomenon, and not only very interesting, but very needy, right? Very important that we focus in on this issue of social cohesion and ways to create it. So kind of in summary, I wanted to share a quick example of how we apply some of these kind of sort of, conceptual and mathematical tools in a practical way. Jimmy, next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you very much. This was a recent, I think it's at this point our most recent Positive Peace workshop in Colombia this April, with social leaders, reintegrated FARC guerrillas. Those of you who may be unfamiliar with the context in Colombia, Colombia has essentially been at civil war for the last 50 years. It was signed a peace agreement in 2016. This workshop here included all different sort of components or stakeholders in that conflict. Jimmy, next slide, please. In terms of sort of the workshop format that we follow, presenting these pillars of positive peace that you see here and looking and studying together the aspect of social cohesion, The workshop format is, quite similar to, I'm sure, what many of you have already, including myself, have experienced in these kinds of trainings, either being in them or facilitating them. Learning objectives, for example, this workshop was relatively successful. How capable do you feel of explaining the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peace? We see a doubling of that in terms of feeling capable. Again, this is based on perceptions, but also very important, right, as to how people determine whether an individual workshop of any kind has been successful or not. Jimmy, next one, please. Another learning objective here. How capable do you feel of using peace as a tool for context analysis and community assessment? Again, a doubling of the scores, pre and post workshop as well. Next one, please, Jimmy. How capable do you feel of applying a peace perspective to the development of a social, the developmental social impact project? Excuse me, there's a bit of a typo here. Again, how to be able to leverage things like the positive peace framework and the social barometer, social cohesion barometer that we're going to be talking about next in these kind of workshops and conversations in and with communities. And lastly, last slide, please, Jimmy, thank you. How capable do you feel of providing recommendations or support for others? So this is a very interesting one as well, right? Because it also speaks to a component of social cohesion. In this case, tripling in terms of the people feeling capable. And by the end of the workshop, everyone feeling capable to a degree. Jimmy, next slide, please. But the one that I really wanted to focus on is this one. So presenting tools like the positive peace pillars, like the social cohesion barometer tool that we're going to be delving into a bit later on, provides an ideal opportunity to not only better understand some of the complexity and the systems that David was alluding to, but also create social cohesion in its place and during that time. So here are some of the images from the workshop. For example, on the left-hand side here, you see people talking about who are the different stakeholders that we should be including as and when we try and find new ways of building positive peace and developing programmatic initiatives related to all of these different pillars of positive peace. What do the pillars of positive peace mean in our particular context, in the context of Colombia? And how would we actually score that in terms of Colombia, right? In terms of our own municipality, for example. How well do we as a municipality do in well-functioning government or free flow of information? Very interestingly, the participants in this workshop created their own mini positive peace index of their community as well. And lastly, again, touching on this central photo on the bottom side here, touching on the aspects of systems and complexity as well. So again, this is all about providing those tools that kind of sort of really try and reflect something that is complex, sure, but is very solid. It needs to be flexible, it needs to be simple, it needs to be useful, it needs to be practical. The result of a lot of this, when these tools are presented, is an increase in social cohesion, as you can see down here on the right-hand side. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to my kind colleague Adita, who's going to share more information about the social barometer tool developed by CRS.
Thank you, Michael, very much. Great presentation. And I really do want to start with this practical insight that you said, because most of the times when we work in different NGOs, local or international, we are thinking that the way how we are working is really influencing social cohesion, or like other way that social cohesion is influencing our work. But we somehow do not have or courage or enough knowledge and skills to try to seek for these interconnections. And during today's session, I would try to give at least some insight of how we are doing that in CRS. Thank you, everybody who joined this session today. I am Edita Trolo-Zahirovic, and I'm Technical Advisor for Social Cohesion for Influence and Learning with Catholic Relief Services. For those of you who are not aware, CRS is 8 years old international relief and development organization that works in over 100 countries around the world and has been doing peace building and social cohesion work in more than 40 countries with millions of people. Next slide, Jimmy, thank you. And although our actually relief and development work is accomplished through programs of emergency response, HIV, health, agriculture, water, education, and others, CRS really in its every segment recognizes the importance of social cohesion. We believe as an organization that for development to happen, people need to listen and trust one another, find consensus and work together. When people and communities are supported in addressing what divides them and building on what unites them, they work to build stronger, healthier, and more just social ties. And actually, this is the kind of transformational change that gets results, not only in social cohesion and peace building field, but actually across other humanitarian and development sectors. Still, what I've just said is just a premise, isn't it? And with all complexity that David spoke about and Michael about what social cohesion brings, how do we know that our hypothesis is meaningful if we are not trying to measure? How do we know what we are measuring and whether our measurements are relevant if we know that social cohesion really interlinks with other concepts such as cultural norms that are also complex, economics, local and global politics, governance, and rule of law, and many other society segments? In our experience, before even start to think about measurements, we need to make sure that we have a clear defined social cohesion construct or a peace building construct, and that we need to define on its metrics, to have a clear social cohesion methodology, actually to plan activities that are deliberately and systematically incorporated in programs. We need to adapt because there is so many different available tools, or create a reliable and appropriate tool for measuring social cohesion. And also what at the end is that we need to interpret our results appropriately. So during our session today, I will try to give you an insight into how CRS approach these challenges of measuring social cohesion and what kind of learning we have come so far. At first, as I said, you need a definition. So the CRS's definition of social cohesion is that social cohesion is a strength, quality of relationship between and among individuals, groups, and communities that is coupled with linkages between society and state, markets, and other institutions, all based on trust, respect, mutuality, and equal opportunity for dignity and well-being of every person and common good for all. Besides this definition, CRS also have its social cohesion framework that you can see now on the screen, and that is helping us in developing different assessment methodologies and measurements by exploring beneficiaries and general population perception of social cohesion. I'm very happy that Michael also said something about pros and cons of measuring perception, but actually having this a framework that explains how social cohesion, how we understand social cohesion, and combining with perception is sometimes everything that one organization, local or international NGO, can dedicate into measuring processes. You can see that this framework explains how social cohesion encompasses three broad spheres of society: sociocultural, economic, and political sphere. But those spheres are also determined by the strengths and quality of horizontal and vertical relations. And all of them are vitally important for peace, justice, and society. Next slide, Jimmy, please. Therefore, CRS, for our own needs, developed a perception-based tool called CRS, or a mini social cohesion barometer, to support our peace building work. Originally, this tool was created as a facilitation tool for social cohesion workshops to gauge workshops participants' opinions or perception on their social cohesion level in a different context, group, or geographic area. Basically, the mini barometer was a qualitative tool that we've used in many programming, both like peace building programming or integrated programming. The tool consists of 18 statements related to sociocultural, economic, and political spheres described a few minutes ago in our framework, but it also represents two dimensions. For example, under the sociocultural sphere, one statement explores the acceptance of diversity by asking people to what extent they agree or disagree on a 5-point Likert scale about their community trust, regardless of identity differences. Or under the economic sphere, we explore opportunities when asking about decent living conditions. Or when we explore about social contract, when asking, are people in communities treated equally by public officials under the political sphere? And although this tool was really designed for workshop settings and to gauge this discussion and to have a different sense of how people are feeling about where they're living, but different teams within CRS started to use this tool as a part of their monitoring, evaluation, and learning system. Actually, they started using it as a survey tool, as a quantitative tool. In Bangladesh, the Barometer was the basis for a pre-project design assessment. In the Lake Chad Basin and Sahel region, project teams have used the Barometer as a context monitoring instrument to inform adaptive management. And in Central Africa Republic and elsewhere, the Barometer has been applied in a population-based survey and treated as a quantitative measure of social cohesion to establish baseline and endline metrics to gauge changes in perceived levels of social cohesion in project areas. Initially, we were really apprehensive about this generic tool use. So we started working with Institute for Economics and Peace, who ran different statistical analysis on data set from 8 countries. They validated appropriateness of the Barometer as a measure of social cohesion, and they developed 2 social cohesion indexes, 4 spheres and dimensions. So you can see like everything is following our framework. So now we are recommending to use the tool through the whole project cycle. In a project design, project evaluation, monitoring, context monitoring, but also some special research. The time that we have allotted for this session will not allow me to talk in details about the results and learning we have so far, but I would like to emphasize that using the Barometer for measurements, now we are able to look what differences does social cohesion make to program outcomes in agricultural cooperatives yields and incomes, saving and internal lending group economic well-being, women's nutrition status, community support to schools, disaster risk reduction, and other sectors. And as a final example, I just wanted to highlight one short-term study, preliminary findings from USAID Integrated Youth Development Activity Project that suggests project in DRC that is focused actually on equipping youth with employment opportunities. Yes, Jimmy, you can go to a next slide, please. Yeah, in DRC focused on equipping youth with employment opportunities. Actually, the results of this short-term study showed that the reported effects of social cohesion strengthening and conflict management skills training for those youth groups were greater and more significant in the economic sphere than in sociocultural sphere. While results in the sociocultural sphere tend to improve both for treatment and control groups, likely because the effects of the savings and lending groups on intra-group bonding cohesion, from initial review findings, the team is seeing notable improvements in the economic outcomes for treatment groups. We would miss this great learning without the tools and teams' readiness to use it. I will finish my presentation with this, but I have to say that we've planned for you for today's session that you experience the Barometer as a tool. We prepared a digitalized version of the Barometer, and briefly, Jimmy will instruct you how you should take this survey. But before I do that, please be mindful that because we are so diverse group, summary data will not present accurate picture about the social cohesion, but we hope it will give you an insight on at least one way how you can measure social cohesion. Thank you so much. And Jimmy, can you share the tool and please instruct further? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adita and David and Michael. I just dropped the link. So we put the social cohesion barometer tool on mentimeter.com. And so you can go ahead to the chat and click on the link, menti.com/ all those letters and numbers, or you can open on your phone or in another device, menti.com, or on another browser window, and type in the code 91095035. And in a second here, I will share the screen. And as you'll see, once you get into the Mentimeter, you'll see this. You'll see different, oh, good. We already have a bunch of results. Excellent. You'll see a sliding scale, and you can move the sliding scale from if you don't agree at all, and then completely agree at the top. And there's 3 different slides. So once you've filled out all of the sliding scales for the first slide, you can press submit, and it'll automatically take you to the next sphere. So let me know in the chat if you're having any issues with Menti, and then we'll be able to get a nice snapshot of the use of the Mentimeter, of the barometer here in today's group. Adita, it looks like we're getting some good results here.
Yeah, great. Great. We might wait for a minute.
Certainly.
So people can finish, and I will briefly comment. I think we're good, Jimmy. What do you think?
Yeah, it looks like we have 21 results. So that's great.
Great. So I will just briefly comment the results that we have as a group related to 3 different spheres of social cohesion. And as you can see, by using this tool, it can give you just a brief insights of how people feel about, for example, perception. Is everybody treated with dignity regardless of who they are? We can see here that that question, actually that statement has the lowest score, but one with almost higher score is I have a strong ties across diverse groups in my community. Having this quantitative information, it gives you an opportunities really to explore more qualitatively, asking people to describe true focus groups or any other key informative interviews if you are interested in diving in and understanding the context very well. But if not, it can also help you to see how you will organize your programming around these perception, because basically we are working with people when we are working on a field, and their perceptions are very relevant for us. And just to Michael's point, this survey is not something that you can consider as a final data. You can always triangulate the data from the barometer with other reports available, such as Peace Index reports, in different countries and other country reports to see like where is the difference between the indexes, but also the perceptions. The same thing I can say for the political economic sphere, Jimmy, thank you. Yeah, this group said like public resources are managed fairly for the benefit of all people. You score that lowest, and probably most of the time that is the case. And you can see a political sphere where most of the question under the political sphere are also reflecting on the vertical dimension of our social cohesion framework. Jimmy, you can go to political one. You can see how relationships are developed between people in the community and structures in a community. And for example, the highest rate here, and I don't think it's surprisingly, because you're most of you who joined this call are already active in your communities. You rated the statements, I actively participate in activities that addresses shared concern of the community, like the highest. So these are just a brief insights, not of how you can look at the barometer data, but we've also prepared some of additional questions for you to gauge a discussion in the breakout rooms. Jimmy will now start the breakout rooms, and he will share a couple of questions we would like for you to discuss along with the screenshots of the barometer results. Yeah. Michael, do you want anything to say? Okay, I can see the pen. Okay, good.
All right, so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into the breakout rooms, and I'll send a message shortly with the screenshots and the discussion questions, and we'll see you back here in a little bit. Welcome back. I think all of the rooms are closed, and we should all be back in the main room now. Over to you, David.
Sorry, just trying to find the mute button there.
You bet.
All right. So, first of all, let's see what we have in. Does anybody have any questions from those breakout rooms, first of all? Anything that you want to add to the main group? Any particular points that came up that you thought were important, or questions that you want to raise to everyone?
Yes, there is something I would want to clarify concerning the political aspect of the barometer. There was a question that was that political representatives in my community listening to the people. I'm kind of paraphrasing it. And I discussed with James that question to me was a bit tricky, because people sometimes in communities engage all the different kinds of people in decision making, and sometimes there is a level of tokenism. But if the actions of political agents do not reflect whatever discussions that they had with the community people, then is that question, what is the goal of that question? Is it just the listening, or also effective listening, where they put whatever that they hear in practice, or whatever they come to conclusion on in practice? Thank you. My name is Paul, Stuttgart University of Brunei.
Thank you, Paul. Michael, Edita, any responses?
Yeah, I can take this one. Yeah, so I think that this is a great question. And I have to say there is something that we've skipped for this barometer experience. Especially those modifications for the barometer were done based on the Institute for Economics and Peace recommendations, but also recommendations when we've discussed with our teams who were using the barometer as a MEL tool. So we've decided that for if you're using a barometer as a survey, you will have a preambulum that will explain the context. So that you're measuring, for example, the relationship between perception of beneficiaries or general population related to governance structures in a specific area or more broader. You can also describe in that preamble what is of your interest. Is it of your interest to explore just the general relationship or some substantial relationship? And before using the barometer, actually giving the barometer to beneficiaries, you would have this preambula where you describe what the question aims for, because we know that most of the questions are still very broad, so that the results you are getting are reliable. Does this help? Did I answer your question, Paul?
Yes, that is helpful. Thank you.
So, excuse me, getting back to the questions that we have for in general, have the different terms of the barometer made you think about social cohesion in your community differently? Do you find something of use there?
I'd be very happy to jump in and perhaps sort of share maybe some thoughts from the group, if that works, from the group that I was in, unless there are any additional questions. Yeah. So I think probably, one of the first questions that came up for us was actually kind of the identifying the boundaries of the system, right? In a nutshell, okay, well, what community am I going to focus on? Am I going to think about my country? Am I going to think about my town? Am I even going to think about my family even? So that's critical to start, to sort of start that process. And it's a great lead-on question to sort of then develop these conversations. I mean, in our group, we obviously came from radically different backgrounds. We were kind of sort of from around the world. So, in that sense, it was very interesting to sort of start unpacking what the different perceptions related to the different components were. But it was already starting us to help to kind of sort of hone in on, okay, the political components, the economic and the social. So although it's very, very broad, it's already providing us the ability to sort of start drilling down on particular components. And yeah, so those, that in essence, I think that we were already starting to sort of go down to get down to something specific, despite the fact that we were all had very, very different perspectives and were based in different places as well.
Great. Okay, so I want to make sure we have time for Isabel and Chris to present their case studies. So let's switch over to that. And if we have some time after that, we'll get back to a couple of questions. I know we have one or two in the chat, but please put them up. If we don't get to them now, we can always make sure that we get to them later on. But let me switch over to Isabel and Chris. Isabel, do you want to start us off, and then we'll shift over?
Yes, of course. Thank you, David. Before starting, I want to present myself. I am the regional technical advisor for peacebuilding and violence prevention at the regional office of CRS in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'm happy to be here with you for sharing our experience and lessons learned regarding the use of mini barometer for social cohesion as a MEL tool. Next, please, Jimmy. Well, we try to strengthen social cohesion and justice approaches and methodologies and practices into an ongoing project named Water Smart Agriculture Enterprise, ASA Emprende in Spanish, which started on November the 1st, 2021, and will end on October the 30th, 2026. As part of our Vision 2030, a more decisive strategy for integrating social cohesion and justice in all programming was adopted. In this specific case, the integration process into an ongoing project implied designing the results framework with those lenses, the theory of change, of course, and in general, a MEL system. Next, please. Jimmy, can you help me? Okay, thank you. We were conscious that the context was very unstable and challenging. And as part of our implementing strategies, we had to incorporate social cohesion and justice contents which can be as we saw with when using the barometer, those contents can be difficult to address in rural areas and in those contexts that there were, especially in the political sphere, were challenging. So those contents that we were trying to introduce into agricultural curriculum were during the initial stages of the COVID pandemic, and we also had to do our baseline within all that. In this frame, we decided to include the barometer into the survey that we were going to use for the baseline in rural communities of two countries, Nicaragua and Honduras. Besides the general information that regarding the people with whom we were planning to work, mostly producers and agricultural extensionists, we decided to use the survey of the barometer plus questions to obtain information about vulnerable groups, especially women and youth. Next, Jimmy, please. Okay. At the end, after using the tool, we obtain the information like the one you are looking in the slide, in the graphic, refer to the questions of the barometer, which really clearly contributed to our baseline. But also this helped us to establish or to design a new way to name abstract or unknown concepts like social cohesion. And as a consequence of our experience using the barometer, we are now referring to this entire process of integrating social cohesion and justice throughout all the activities and strategies of the project. We are naming that a healthy agricultural environment, which is more clear for people with whom we are working and has something really a good link, a positive link with between social cohesion activities with the overall goals that they are pursuing with an agricultural program. We also were able to train technical staff and microfinance field agents, not only in their traditional areas, but also in key social cohesion and justice approaches and methodologies like gender and peaceful masculinities. Next, please. Well, regarding key learnings, first we have to say that the lessons learned in this process really underline the importance of ensuring what we call a participatory tropicalization process of the tool, which means not only the language, using Spanish, of course, for the questions, but also making sure that we are using the concepts that are familiar with participants, the right words for naming each aspect of the barometer. Second, the integration process, including the use of the barometer, as I mentioned, should also consider a smooth integration into the overall framework, mostly to avoid the idea that what you are proposing in a development program means work overload, not only for staff, but also for people that have already a lot to do and a lot on their shoulders at the end. Another learning refers to that we need prior knowledge of gender norms, especially of gender norms and mandates of the context, and do not take them for granted, even if you are of the country. And we need also to have prior knowledge on how communities interpret abstract and often complex concepts that the ones that the barometer use. This is key for ensuring that the survey and how it is being used is properly contextualized. Another learning is that we need to provide training for data collectors, and during training sessions, we need to learn through modeling or through how to ask questions. And we need definitely the preamble that Erika was mentioning. And during those modeling spaces or modeling activities, we need to rehearse at some point how to make the questions, but also how to respond, how you can expect people will respond. Those kind of activities are key to make sure that collectors are ready for starting the process. And as the last point mentioned, in very vulnerable communities, the tool cannot be self-administered. You need to rely on people that will help you to use the mini barometer. The next, please. And what challenges are we facing currently?
We need to move forward fairly quickly.
Okay,
so
okay, thank you. Sorry. The barometer is now shaping our regional peacebuilding strategy. We are using what we have learned is contributing to the work that CRS is delivering in Central America and Haiti, and not only in agriculture, but also in emergencies, migration, food security, youth workforce development, etc. As part of the process, we adapted the barometer in a new tool in which we are combining the indicators of the survey with the CRS signature approach for generating social cohesion, which builds binding, bonding, and bridging methodologies, practices, and approaches on a horizontal and a vertical direction. And besides that, we also included attitudinal, practical, and aspirational changes as a reference for classifying a set of 20 main goals with indicators that a project could use to ensure that social cohesion and justice is adequately being integrated. And through all these efforts, at the end, we are using the barometer as a learning tool and as a tool that is helping us to navigate in a highly volatile and unstable political context. Thank you.
Terrific. Chris?
Yes. Hi. Okay. Thank you, David. So I know that we're a bit pushed for time, so I will try and run through this case study quite quickly. So good morning, everyone, and I just want to introduce myself. I'm the program design lead for an international humanitarian development organization based in the UK called Tear Fund. Which works in 50 of the poorest and probably most fragile countries in the world today. But this morning, I actually want to share an experience of using social cohesion measurement tools from my time working as the Deputy Head of Civil Affairs in UNMIL, which was the UN peacekeeping mission in Liberia between 2016 and 2018. And I hope that this practical example will help demonstrate how social cohesion monitoring tools can be applied in support of evidence-based decision-making. In this particular case, the way that the UN system used modalities very similar to the CRS mini barometer to shape program design. And one key result of this particular story is that social cohesion became an objective, or measuring social cohesion became an objective of the government of Liberia in support of its own national development planning process. I want to go back to June 2016 when UNMIL relinquished its security cover for Liberia and handed back security functions to the Liberian state after 14 years of what one could call international trusteeship of the country's security. Those of you who know the history of West Africa will know that Liberia underwent a horrendous civil war for a number of decades. The handover of security functions started the countdown to UNMIL's departure from the country, which was in March 2018. At that moment, we faced, or we were confronted, what we considered to be a critical 18-month period as Liberia underwent two major transitions. The first was elections that were scheduled in the autumn of 2017, which would see the first democratic transfer of power for 70 years. And the second was UNMIL's transfer of its sustaining peace mandate to UN agencies, the national authorities, and civil society. The Liberia Peacebuilding Plan, which was requested by the UN Security Council in December 2016, assessed that at that time, Liberia's peace was fragile and a peace dividend had not been seen by the majority of the country's people. Recognizing that this fragile peace was born of the inability to resolve many of the root causes of conflict which had been responsible for the civil war, UNMIL, UNDP, and the Liberia Peacebuilding Office, which was located in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, commissioned work to identify the drivers of social cohesion and to understand what peace-building programs would be best employed to support resilient peace infrastructures. With UN funding, a social cohesion measurement tool was adapted to the Liberian reality. It showed that social cohesion in Liberia rested on two societal assets: coexistence and civic trust, and society's rejection of violence as a route to social and political change. We used participatory research processes which explored relevant social, political, and economic themes, many of which are quite similar to the 18 questions that were showed earlier by Edita. So we ran the study twice between 2016 and 2018, collecting a huge amount of data, and I'm just going to highlight a few high-end results. So the studies identified outcomes of interest and social cohesion measurement scores, which were calculated for all 15 counties of the country, and this allowed us to identify vulnerable counties and social cohesion characteristics such as confidence in state institutions and perceived progress to reconciliation at a quite local level. We shared these results with our colleagues in the UN Police, the UNPOL, political affairs section of UNMIL, and also the head of UN agencies. At the time, we were incredibly concerned about election violence or election-related violence leading up to the election process in October 2017. And so we used these results to target what we called QIPs, or quick impact peace building projects, in specific regions of the country which we considered to be red flags. Given the emphasis on youth, we also designed, based upon the results, a number of initiatives which involved youth political party representatives. One overall observation from the studies was that there was a very strong relationship between levels of trust in government and people's confidence in the peace process. So faith in government institutions was driven by the efficacy of government services, which in turn was associated with positive perceptions of coexistence and civic trust. For us in UNMIL, we could see that monitoring people's trust in governing institutions was a critical factor in understanding people's perceptions of peace and a peace dividend. While strengthening people responsive state institutions was already a major area of the UN's work in peace consolidation. These results did help direct our attention to policies and programs focused on government service delivery, strengthening the state's provision of justice and security, and providing communities with better livelihood opportunities. And my final point is that in 2018, the government of Liberia actually incorporated several of the social cohesion metrics that were developed under the project into its 5-year development plan, which was entitled the Pro-Poor Agenda Prosperity for Peace and Development. In 2021, UNDP funded a third study, which confirmed that confidence in government institutions remains a key driver for people's perceptions of peace, socioeconomic progress, and personal safety. Thank you, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. I know that we have gone a few minutes over time, and I think it's a mark of how interesting everybody finds all of this material that we still have so many people in the room. I will say, let's take a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or just raise your hand or just jump in. I know our presenters are all here and can take those questions, but we're also happy to follow up with you afterwards if you want to send things to us directly. So if you have any questions that we can put up in the chat right now, please do, and we will answer them over the next couple of minutes. If everybody doesn't mind sticking around for those, terrific. So we have one from Sammy here. Integration of social cohesion tools into quick impact projects was quite innovative. What lessons can we learn for long-term programming? Does anyone want to take that?
I mean, I'm happy to respond to that. Yeah. I mean, but there was also challenges with our work because by its nature, we had very limited time as the UN peacekeeping mission to actually implement these projects. And I think it's quite evident that long-term programming and social cohesion is the proper the proper constellation of factors to actually push at transformative peace. I suppose the one thing that I would say is that you know, the piloting certain initiatives based upon social cohesion data can actually lead to larger programming opportunities. You know, oftentimes donors are keen to see evidence that things work, and so quick impact projects, for want of a better word, which are can be quite cheap and are done quite quickly, can actually help to generate that evidence.
Thank you, Chris. Do we have any other questions that anyone wants to raise now? Going once, going twice. Okay. So we will all be around through the rest of this conference. If anybody wants to follow up with questions, we are always reachable as well. So I want to thank all of our presenters. Thank Institute for Economics and Peace and Catholic Relief Services for putting this together. And looking forward to interacting with all of you. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel, and we will talk with you all very soon. Cheers all, and have a great rest of the conference.